talk a little bit about the authority of Scripture, and just jump in here, okay, if you have comments or questions. I don't have just a ton of material on this issue, but I mean, it doesn't have to be a long segment either. But okay, so I want to talk now about the authority of the Bible. We talked some about the inspiration of the Bible, and there's really a lot more that can be said about the inspiration of the Bible. It's a very complex issue, and so is the notion of the authority of the Bible. So I want to quote from N.T. Wright, who's a really very fine biblical scholar. And he says, the phrase authority of Scripture, when unpacked, offers a picture of God's sovereign and saving plan for the entire cosmos, dramatically inaugurated by Jesus himself, and now to be implemented through the Spirit-led life of the church precisely as the Scripture reading community. So what's he getting at here? That as a Scripture reading community, we're living into, by the guidance of Scripture, the plan of salvation that God has laid out in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Does that make sense? Scripture, if we understand the authority of Scripture right, Scripture is going to lead us into a life consistent with what God envisions for us. Now, authority, as we use that word, has a couple of different meanings. So if we say that someone has authority, we say that person has some decision-making power. If a professor has authority over her students, then the professor can assign readings. The professor can evaluate papers and assign grades and shape course content. She has been invested with this authority. It's not just her authority, it's the authority of her institution. Okay, so I'm a professor, and I write a syllabus for my class, and my students are enrolled at United Theological Seminary, and so they have to do the assignments for the class, or they make an F from United Theological Seminary. Now, if I just come up to someone like at church and I just hand them the syllabus and I say, here you go, you need to do this work, they don't care. They don't have to do that. Okay, so the authority that I have comes from the authority, from a larger authority behind me. The authority that Scripture has also comes from a larger authority. It comes from the authority of God. Now, another thing we mean by authority is we say that if a professor speaks with authority on a particular topic, she is knowledgeable and competent regarding that topic. So if I go into church history class with a church history professor, I would hope that that church history professor is actually an authority on church history. And that means that this person has done the necessary work and acquired the necessary expertise to speak as an authority on this topic. All right. If I just go to Walmart and go grab someone and take them to my class and say, "Here, I want you to talk about church history," and they start talking, that person doesn't speak with authority. In the Bible, speaks with authority into our lives because God is a very creator and redeemer of our lives. God knows more about our lives than we ever could and has given us Scripture to guide us in our life of faith. Okay? So the authority of Scripture, means that there is a larger authority standing behind it, and that authority is qualified to speak into our lives in meaningful ways. Scripture makes binding claims on our lives. Okay? Here's another way to put it. The Bible has authority because God has authority. And God has authority simply by virtue of who He is. Okay, what comments or questions do you have about biblical authority?
So, when we speak authority over the adversary,
Yeah.
I assume we have authority over him. How is that possible?
When we speak with authority over Satan,
Yes, sir.
we have authority over him, and how is that possible?
Yes, sir.
Right? We have authority, but it's not our own.
Okay, there we go.
Yep. It's the authority that's given to us as followers of Jesus and children of God, baptized into the household of faith. And because of that authority, the enemy doesn't have power over our lives. Okay? All right, any other questions about the authority of Scripture? Okay, so the authority of Scripture means Scripture speaks into our lives in binding ways. And we need to take that seriously. Now, it may not on an individual reading always be clear what Scripture is saying in our lives. And so we consult our community of faith so that we can understand better what God is saying to us through the words of Scripture. Okay?
Which, correct me if I'm wrong, requires an immense amount of humility.
And that requires humility, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it certainly does. But, if you don't have humility, if you just live long enough, you'll usually get it. Okay. Now, that's not to say that every passage in the Bible has equal authority to every other passage in the Bible. Okay, but we'll get at a later point of kind of like how we interpret which passages in the Bible have the most binding influence upon our lives. Okay. All right, so that wraps up our lecture on authority. Thank you.